Tensions between state and federal governments appear to be rising over the issue of how to manage national parks. The Federal Environment Minister, Tony Burke, was reported in Fairfax papers just last week saying, and this is a quote, "National parks are for families and nature. They are not farms, rifle ranges, mine sites or logging coupes." Now, that comment was triggered in part by moves in Queensland to let cattle graze in parks, which was the latest in a string of state government decisions at odds with the Environment Minister's view of parks management. Earlier this morning, I spoke to lecturer in ecology at Deakin University, Euan Ritchie, and asked him how he views the current state of state-federal relations when it comes to national parks.
Yeah, we've got a massive problem right now in Australia with our national parks, particularly because a whole range of state governments proposed new uses of these national parks, which go counter to conserving biodiversity.
What sort of uses are you talking about?
We're talking about hunting, we're talking about logging, we're talking about grazing of national parks, we're talking about hotels and developments in national parks.
So you've pretty much described the entire east coast there of the mainland Australia. That's an issue in Victoria, one in New South Wales and one in Queensland.
That's correct.
Can we go back to some basics first? How does the relationship between the state government and the federal government work when it comes to jurisdiction over decisions of a national park, in a national park?
Yeah, look, that's right. So basically there's only 6 national parks in Australia that are managed by the Commonwealth, and that includes Kakadu National Park, Christmas Island National Park and a few others. The rest of the national parks are actually managed by the state authorities, and the federal government can step in where there's a threatened species or endangered species or something else of concern where they need to step in, but generally speaking, the state governments actually manage the national parks, and that's why there's a great concern right now about this, because some of these state governments are proposing uses of these national parks, which many are concerned about.
So the state government manages the national parks, but what, does funding come from the Commonwealth?
Some of it would certainly come from the federal government, and some also would probably come from the state as well. But my understanding is that most of it would come from the Commonwealth. Okay.
So even though we have this idea of national parks around Australia, there's not necessarily any consistency in how they're managed from one state to the next.
No, and therefore the term national park is almost confusing in itself, because they're not run by a national authority, they're run by the states. And so even though I guess they're available to anyone in Australia, they're actually run by the states.
But they do tend to have a higher level of protection than a state reserve or
Absolutely. They have a much higher level of protection than, say, a state forest or even just a minor reserve does. That's right.
Okay. So at the moment, you mentioned there that there are examples when the Commonwealth can step in when it relates to a threatened species. Surely many of these national parks are home to endangered or threatened species.
Exactly right. And that's our concern, is that, our national parks are basically set up to conserve biodiversity. And as we also know that we're right now in the midst of an extinction crisis, so we're losing thousands of species per year. And these national parks are critical in helping us to conserve what species are left. And therefore, by putting any further pressure on these national parks, by the threats that we've talked about, that's really going to put these threatened species at further risk of extinction.
Can you give me some examples of when the federal government has exercised its power, has stepped in to control or veto a management decision? Grazing in Victoria would be
so the alpine grazing would be one situation where the federal government stepped in and said that this was clearly not a good idea. And you certainly have species like the crabberry frog up in the alpine zone, which is critically endangered. So you have a southern species and northern species. And they would be heavily impacted by grazing, because grazing would impact the swamps that these species live in. So that would be one example.
Okay, so the presence of that threatened frog, for instance, means that Tony Burke had more power in that instance than he may have.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And like you said before, there's many examples. You can almost look at most national parks and find a threatened species within them.
So that means if we stick with the grazing example at the moment, do you believe if he wanted to, Tony Burke could intervene in the Queensland example of the grazing at the moment there?
Yeah, well, my understanding is that Tony Burke is actually currently looking at the laws at the moment to see whether he can actually increase the federal government's powers over the states, because that's a concern that, the impact of grazing on these national parks in Queensland may place threatened species at further risk. My understanding is that at current state he actually can't step in unless we can identify endangered species that would be put at risk by this grazing. But also, you would have seen in the news last week that Tony Burke was talking about trying to actually increase government or federal government control.
Through legislation.
Exactly, through legislation, exactly.
Yeah, okay, so that's a development that may happen down the track. But presumably under the example you described there, that if there was a native if there was an endangered species found in the Queensland national parks, that could be used to stop the grazing. Would the same apply in the hunting example in New South Wales and the development example in Victoria?
Well, I mean, I guess it's hard to predict the future, and it's hard to predict what governments will do. I think if there was enough pressure, then potentially Tony Burke would step in. But you'd also be aware, of course, we're coming up to a federal election, and who knows what's going to happen post-September. So it's very difficult to predict the future. I think the point would be that we really shouldn't have to come to the situation, though, where we're constantly having to go from national park to national park and the federal government step in to try and stop the state governments doing things which will go counter to conserving biodiversity.
Tony Burke's statements last week, though, they actually raise a really interesting question about what is the purpose of a national park. He seems to think they are really there first and foremost for conservation, whereas there seems to be a view amongst other groups now that perhaps they're there for use, public use.
Yeah, although if you actually look at what the majority of Australians would say, the majority of Australians would say that they're to preserve nature and to enjoy that nature, and they were set up with that reason in the first place. So many years ago, a lot of our relatives actually set aside areas of land, recognising their value as development progressed. That these areas were critical for conserving biodiversity, and they want to be preserved that way. So yes, there are some out there who would say, well, they should be open to other uses, and that includes the hunting lobbies, of course. But it would also be worth pointing out that there's areas for people to hunt already.
My guest here on Bush Telegraph is Euan Ritchie, lecturer in ecology at Deakin University. We're discussing what's happening with management decisions in national parks around Australia at the moment. This comes after some controversial decisions have been made or are in the process of being made in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria that relate to the management of national parks. Euan, do you agree that the current resourcing for national parks is not sufficient?
Absolutely. And I think that's a really critical point because, no one would argue that our rangers and our managers and our parks are not doing a terrific job under very difficult circumstances. So some of them are managing very large national parks like Kakadu National Park or Lakefield National Park in North Queensland. They're huge national parks with very few staff, and they still have to manage, getting on top of pests, keeping fences up and all those kind of things with very little resources. And we're already losing species at a great rate, and Kakadu National Park is probably the best example of that. Our mammal fauna in Kakadu National Park has absolutely crashed, and we're now likely to see a whole wave of new extinctions. So therefore, to then propose new threats to these national parks, like having people shooting in national parks, having people logging, new developments, is not only going to make it harder for biodiversity to survive, but it's also actually going to put increased strain on the staff who have to work in those national parks to manage even more things.
Isn't there an argument that these sort of decisions actually bring in private resources or private money to do some of the management that public money is not funding at the moment?
That's an argument that's made, and I think in some cases that's probably a valid argument. But one would also have to say what actual costs come with those. So as an example, if you bring in cattle to graze in a national park, what impact is that going to have in terms of spreading weeds, eroding waterways, damaging fences? Likewise, if you allow hunting in a national park, what damage will there be to roads? Is there going to be damage to infrastructure? All those other things that go with that. So yes, in some cases, some money might come in, but there also might be unexpected consequences and costs involved.
But it's all about a balance, surely, because the hunting example is a good one where you'll hear the argument that it's actually a cost-effective way of removing feral species. Yeah,
look, that's an argument that's often made about hunting in national parks, but actually scientifically it doesn't often stand up. So we have very good evidence to suggest that, recreational hunting in national parks is certainly not going to actually reduce pest species. In actual fact, it may make the problem worse in some cases.
But we regularly hear on this program, Bush Telegraph, from farmers in particular who'll say that almost the worst neighbour you can have is a national park because the weeds won't be controlled and the land won't be managed as closely as what you will see on private land, and that's normally attributed to a funding situation or a resourcing situation. So surely there needs to be some kind of rethink of a new way forward.
No one would question that there needs to be better resources for our national parks to manage our national parks better, but I don't think allowing or opening up our national parks to hunting and grazing is the way to do that.
Private development?
Private development is a tricky one. Of course, there is some private development in places like Cradle Mountain National Park in Tasmania. We have some minor developments there, and that's a really tricky one, and I guess that will be for the public to decide on what they think is a level that's appropriate. But we have to remember also why a lot of people use national parks and wilderness They go there because they're undeveloped. They go there to see nature in its natural state, if you like. And so it really raises a very difficult question for us, whether we want to sort of lose that natural state of our national parks or whether we're actually prepared to accept some sort of development.
Because Cradle Mountain will be held up by many people as a real success story. And I wonder if you think there's an argument that something like Cradle Mountain actually allows people that would maybe not go to a national park in other circumstances to become engaged with these kinds of issues.
Yeah, look, I think that's a valid point, but I think the point we also have to make is that some national parks are highly sensitive. So as an example, Point Nepean National Park is a coastal national park in Victoria, and the Victorian government is at the moment actually relaxing laws to allow 99-year leases for national parks for development to continue in some national parks, or to be established even in some national parks. So, Point Nepean National Park could be heavily impacted. It's a coastal environment. It's very sensitive. Grampians National Park, Wilson's Promontory is another one. So I think we have to think very carefully about which national parks we actually decide to allow development in if we decide to make that decision in the first place.
Do you feel we're at a really pivotal point here and what happens in the future?
I think we're at an absolutely critical point, and I think it's good that this has raised the issue, if anything else, that we really need to actually treat our national parks with more respect, but more importantly, we need to give them a lot more resourcing. Like I was saying before, we have a massive problem with extinction in this country and globally, and losing species is not just obviously problematic just because we have less species, but they're actually really important to us for a whole range of reasons, both economically and culturally, and for a whole range of reasons. So our national parks, or a reserve system, if you like, is really critical in conserving those species, and it needs a lot more attention.
Do you think it's politically a viable position to take to say just find more public money to manage the national parks?
I think there's certainly a strong case to say we need to find more money. I mean, the amount of money, as an example, national parks gets compared to, say, the defence budget is astronomically small. So, there's an easy case to make about how critical our biodiversity is. I mean, just think about how much services our forests provide in terms of storing carbon and the impact that will have on reducing the effect of global warming. So, you can make a case very easily how critical our natural world is, our national parks. And so they definitely deserve a lot more attention, a lot more resourcing.
Where do you stand on the argument that perhaps the national parks need to be ranked in terms of their conservation value, and maybe some tough decisions need to be made as to whether or not we can continue to keep some that are deemed as of lesser importance as national parks?
Yeah, look, there's certainly been a controversial idea put forward, and I think including by Hugh Possingham and colleagues, that some national parks could actually even be sold off. So if we can't actually afford to conserve some national parks because it's too costly, you might invest some money in fewer national parks but actually resource them better. So look, that's one idea that we could potentially look at. Again, we'd have to think very carefully about that. And it's problematic, of course, because for a lot of national parks, we still actually don't have a very good idea what species are contained in those national parks. And so we don't actually know what we're going to lose if we hand them over to development. And the other thing we have to think very carefully about is climate change. So as the climate changes, species are going to move, and species are going to need habitats to move to. So a national park now...